Now, I have to admit at times my dislike for the favorable media treatment that Peyton Manning receives, especially from the national sports press, can at times leave me with a little bit of a bias when it comes to both Peyton Manning and the team that he happens to be quarterbacking for in a particular season. Because it always seems like no matter what, you're always going to get bombarded with so much BS when it comes to Peyton Manning, and that's just the way it is. And, to be fair, he's earned a lot of it. Some of it he hasn't, but a lot of it he has. And as a result, it's something I should become more acclimated to and be more willing to accept, even though I don't. And heading into this offseason before the 2012 season, there was all this buzz about where Peyton Manning was going to end up. Now, I do still maintain that the ultimate reason that Peyton Manning chose the Denver Broncos was twofold. One, he didn't want to have to potentially face Eli any sooner than he had to in the playoffs, meaning the Super Bowl, if that was ever the case. And two, instead of going to San Francisco or Tennessee, he wanted to go to a place where the head coach was going to allow him to have free reign due to ego or whatever over the offense. And that's what Denver could offer. They could offer money just like the other two teams, San Francisco and Tennessee, but most importantly of all, they could offer the ability to run the show. And you have to look at the way the 2012 season went for the Denver Broncos and say Manning in general did a very, very good job of running the show. I can't take that away from him. This was a team that is coming off of the Tebow era, who had went 8-8 in 2011, but did win the division. That's how weak the AFC West was. And then won a playoff game against the Steelers in the wild card round. This team started off 2-3, and deep down, I had a little bit of enjoyment out of that. I'm like, ha ha ha! Look at this! Look at this! Peyton Manning can't lead crap. Well, joke's on me. The Broncos won their last 11 games, ended up finishing 13-3, first place in the AFC West, and ended up getting the number one overall seed in the AFC playoff picture. So that means they were going to have home field advantage throughout. Now, myself, deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time, and I put this out there on Facebook, etc. It was only going to be a matter of time before reality caught up with the Denver Broncos and that people saw that Peyton Manning isn't the type of guy that wins you a championship. I still maintain to this day, and you cannot argue this with me, that the only world championship he ever won was the one that Rex Grossman and Lovie Smith gave to him. And that's just the way it is. If you're a Manning fan and you don't want to acknowledge it, that's whatever. You got the trophy. You got the Super Bowl championship. Congratulations, but it doesn't change facts. It is what it is. And you look at this Broncos team. You could talk all you want about what happened in the divisional round. But you're talking about, again, a team that went 13-3, won their last 11 games, had home field throughout. They were playing in the Mile High City, and Baltimore came in there and beat them, and frankly, Flacco outperformed Peyton Manning. Isn't the first time that's ever happened with a Peyton Manning-led team in the playoffs, and who knows, may very well not be the last time. Does not diminish what Peyton Manning did in the regular season in 2012. He had 4,659 passing yards, 37 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. Just another vintage great regular season performance by Peyton Manning. You could easily make the argument that it's either him or Tom Brady are the greatest regular season quarterbacks of all time. Either one of them. You probably would even statistically have to lead to Peyton Manning. He's just that much money, and he's just that good in the regular season. It's frustrating at times that he's not better in the postseason, because in the regular season, more often than not, the guy's money. His team could be down 3 touchdowns, and he'll find a way to bring them back and help them win the game. Ask San Diego how that works out. You look at his receiving core. He has 2 really nice receivers that I really like, in Demaryius Thomas and Eric Decker. Demaryius Thomas had a big year, 94 catches, 1,434 yards, and 10 touchdowns. Eric Decker, 85 catches for 1,064 yards and 13 touchdowns. Peyton has at least 2 legit weapons at flanker and split end on the outside in that Broncos passing attack. And when you look at their offensive statistics overall, they finished 2nd in points per game, 4th overall in yards, 5th in passing yards. They had some balance at times with their running game. They were hurt a little bit, I think, when McGahee went out for the year with injury. Moreno came back, and he was a help to them late, but they still lack some balance on the offensive side of the football. It's definitely a pass-first team. On the defensive side, I said about their 2011 season that I thought, quite frankly, the Broncos' defense was a little bit overrated, and they were. They were a good but not great defense. They had flashes of dominance, but were not dominant all the time, like people maybe thought they were. Now, a player who tends to be dominant almost every week he steps on the field is Von Miller, who had 18 and a half sacks in 2012. And I also have to confess that I was dead wrong about Von Miller as well. I thought going into that 2011 draft that you're nuts for taking a 240-pound outside linebacker, number 2 overall. I'm like, this is Aaron Curry all over again. Well, I was wrong. Hey, I'm willing to admit when I was wrong. For every 8, 9, or 10 that I get right, I might have 1, 2, or 3 times where I'm wrong. Same thing with Aldon Smith. But there are tons of other times where I'm right too. But Von Miller, I'm happy for him because he's definitely proved me wrong. And the defense for the Broncos was much more consistent, especially in the last 11 games of the season after kind of scuffling along the first 5 weeks. And they really pieced together an impressive season. They finished 4th in the league in points allowed, 2nd in total yards allowed, 3rd in rushing yards allowed, 3rd in passing yards allowed. They tied for 1st in the league with St. Louis with 52 sacks. So this was a team that was very good against the run and really generated a lot of pass rush in that 3-4 defense. Now you might sit there and say, well, look at all the stats. That indicates a dominant defense. How was Baltimore able to beat them? Well, I think in part it was because that secondary got exposed. It's not the most talented secondary in the world. Champ Bailey is not the Champ Bailey of 4, 5, 6 years ago. And if you're not able to get a great pass rush on Flacco, you allow him time to sit back there, he probably is going to pick you apart. And that is kind of what happened, I think, to the Broncos in that playoff game. And let's face it, if the Broncos don't get 2 special teams touchdowns from Trenton Holiday, that game wouldn't have even been in a position for Peyton Manning to choke late and throw that interception, or for Raheem Moore to sit there and totally blow the coverage on Jacoby Jones. It's all these other things. But defensively, this is a team that if they don't generate a great pass rush on somebody, if a quarterback's allowed to have time to sit back and go through his reads and progressions, that quarterback, especially if they're really good like a Joe Flacco is probably going to be able to pick them apart, which is exactly what happened in the AFC divisional round. Now, in each of these season recaps that I've done, I've definitely made it a point to talk about a team's draft history over the past 5 years, and in large part, it's usually an indicator of why a team either is or is not successful. But when you look at the Denver Broncos, quite frankly, their 5-year draft history is not all that impressive at all. Now, sure, Ryan Clady is an absolute stud of a left tackle, excuse me, but he's really the only player left from that 2008 draft. That's not good. You look at 2009, Robert Ayers, bust. Alfonso Smith, bigger bust. Noshan Moreno, pretty borderline bust if you ask me. They didn't get a lot out of that draft class. Now, 2010 produced a lot more. It gave him Demaryius Thomas in the first round. It gave him Eric Decker in the fourth round. But you look at it, frankly, Tim Tebow was a first-round pick in that draft, and 3 years later, he's not even there anymore. They got Beatles late as well, so they got some good players. But one of their first-round picks, for all intents and purposes, looking at the long-term picture of the organization, ended up being a bust. Just like in 2009, Ayers was a bust, and, Moreno, you could argue, has pretty much been a bust. 2011, you bring in Von Miller, you get Franklin. Those are probably some of the highlights of that particular class, with Von Miller obviously being the big stud out of that class. But their only real contributor to me out of this last draft was Derek Wolfe, the defensive lineman that they took in the second round, and even he might have been a bit of a reach, needless to say. But they took a guy like Osweiler. It might be years before you find out if he ever contributes anything. Ronnie Hillman really did nothing to establish himself as anything other than a role-playing running back. So you ask, well, how in the hell did this team get to the position they were to go 13-3? Well, you figure they had a solid offensive line. You have Thomas and Decker. And then you bring in Peyton Manning. That can mask deficiencies in a lot of other areas, bringing in a Peyton Manning, not having to trade any draft picks, not having to use a draft pick on him, just signing him off the street. Boy, that does a lot to improve your team in a great big hurry. And I would definitely argue that Peyton Manning was one of the contenders for MVP this season. Not my choice. My choice is Adrian Peterson, and there may be 1 or 2 other guys I would put ahead of him. But Peyton Manning is an incredibly valuable player to any team that he's on, especially when he's right and healthy, which it looked like he clearly was this year. That could compensate for a lot of deficiencies in other areas. And when you add a Von Miller into the mix on defense, that can mask a lot of deficiencies defensively, especially when you pair him up with Elvis Dumervil. That's a hell of a 1-2 combination rushing the quarterback in your 3-4 defense. So similarly to the Houston Texans, I think the Denver Broncos are a team with a very small window of opportunity to try and win a world championship. In fact, you may argue that 2013, maybe 2014 is it. 1 to 2 years as they're currently constructed, because Peyton Manning's an older player. He's not going to be around forever no matter what. And you have to wonder at some point in time where you may start to get some type of drop-off in his skill level and his production. So it's very, very important heading into this 2013 NFL draft that the Broncos hit it big. They need some big contributors in some key areas, and I think in particularly, as you found out during the playoff loss to Baltimore, on the defensive side of the football. This is a team whose defensive line in the 3-4 is not particularly good, and this is a team whose secondary is either old in the case of Champ Bailey or not particularly good in terms of the rest of the players around him. I would expect the Broncos to invest heavily in defense in the first few rounds of this draft, and that would be the right move. They need help at corner. They need help at safety. They need help at defensive tackle. They need help at defensive end. That's where I would spend the majority of my efforts on the first few rounds, trying to improve and shore up those areas and find 1 or 2 real impact players on the defensive side of the football. Offensively, any needs they may have, I would say can be addressed a little bit later in the draft, whether that be spending a 4th-round pick perhaps on a guy who'd come in and be a slot receiver. I think with Thomas and Decker, those 2 guys are great, but Peyton Manning would benefit a little bit more from having another option, a better, younger option out of the slot, and or maybe somebody at tight end as well. Jacob Tammy's okay, but really? You're not going to go too far with Jacob Tamme as your number 1 tight end. You need more out of that position. But the Broncos, this is a team, even with my misgivings about Peyton Manning and the clearly documented fact that he's proven time and time again that he fails to come through for one reason or another in big game situations. All the one-and-dones he's had in the playoffs in his career, all the times he's been outplayed by opposing big-name quarterbacks in big-time situations. But even with that said, if you surround him a little bit with a little bit better talent, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and you could take a little bit of the pressure off of Peyton Manning, this is a team that is a legitimate contender to win the Super Bowl in 2013 and could also be a potential legitimate contender to win the Super Bowl in 2014. But they have to, and I emphasize again, have to hit it big on the defensive side of the football in this upcoming April's draft, or the Broncos will be exactly what they were this year, a team that wins a bunch of regular season games that has no chance of winning a world championship.